Hello everyone, this is Megan Vierick and I'm doing another video to show you how to set up a graph based on data. For this graph we're going to be looking at a line graph instead, so I have a blank Google Sheet here that I'm going to be working with. And again, the first thing I want to do is I want to actually go ahead and title this. Especially as you start to collect more data for a project, it's beneficial to have detailed titles for reference. For mine, I'm going to call this just demonstration for line graph. But I would be more specific about if this was a student, the course maybe, as well as what it's collecting. If this is specifically for STEM, I would make sure I know what it is I'm testing, maybe date parameters, other types of things like that. So for a line graph, what we're going to do is it's a judgment call on whether a line graph or a scatter plot makes more sense based on your data. I tend to think about using line graphs if my one consistent thing I'm going to have on the x-axis is time, and the units that I'm spreading out are always going to be the same intervals. If neither of those checks off, or if only one checks off, then you'd probably be better served for a graph where you are using a scatter plot instead. But just in case, here's a demonstration for setting up a line graph. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my very first cell. So we can see at the top I have columns represented by letters, and I have rows represented by numbers. So I'm going to come in here in A1 and I'm going to type in day. For my particular data set, I am going to start on day 0 and I am going to go all the way through to day 18. And I'm going to look at a couple of different factors. So in this particular setup, we are looking at different concentrations of a chemical called propylene glycol. And I have a 0%, I have a 5%, and I have a 10%. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to set up my headers and I'm going to input my data. What I'd like you to do is pause the video, do the same for your data, and then we'll come back together and see if we need to do anything else to set this up. So you can see at this point all of my data are typed into my sheet. So what I'm going to do next is I'm actually going to name this down here because I want to make sure that this becomes kind of my place where I input data and I do nothing else to it. So I'm going to rename this raw data. You could name it something else. I just find that kind of clear and shows what I'm doing. So what I'm going to do next is I'm actually going to make a copy of this. So you want to kind of think about it like the duplicate in your lab notebook pages that can be used to look at, to reference, or manipulate, but you're not really altering the original. So down here in the bottom left, there's an Add Sheet tab. So I'm going to press this and you can see it makes a new sheet. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this. So if I'm on a computer with a mouse, I right click, or if I'm on a Chromebook, I'm going to press with 2 fingers and I'm going to see the option that comes up as rename, and I'm going to go ahead and name this. Since this is the third video I'm going to call this figure 3, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put down some description of what I'm really looking at. So I'm going to call this propylene glycol and height. So I'm going to put that in here, and then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to not just copy and paste, I want to actually reference these cells. So I'm going to come over here to A1 and I'm going to type in equals. So whenever I type in equals, I am letting Google Sheets know that I want to do a calculation or a reference, something that the computer is going to do for me. What I'm next going to do is I'm going to type in raw data, and I want to make sure that that matches the exact format I have down here. So notice I have a capital R, a capital D, and no space in between. I'm going to put an exclamation point, and then I'm going to type in the cell that I want. So I want the very first cell in the previous one, so I'm going to type in A, and then the number 1, and I'm going to hit enter. And then I have that set up. So I can do the same thing, equals raw data, exclamation point. Now I want B1, and I can hit enter. And you can see here, it's even telling me what it is that the text value that's going to be inputted into here. So I can do this for every single cell. That becomes a little bit tedious or cumbersome. So if instead what I do here is I take a look, when you click on a cell, it gets outlined in blue and there's a little square in the bottom right corner. That crosshair allows me to kind of take this formula and send it down as far as I want. So I brought it a little bit farther than the cell that I ended with. And the reason that is let's say I'm able to continue my experiment for a couple more days and I get a day 19 and maybe a day 20, those values will automatically be updated here, so I don't have to continually go and copy and paste. So please set up the rest of your next tab so it looks like your raw data sheet, and then resume. And this is all we really need to do our setup. So we can actually continue straight through right now and set up our graph. So in order to make a graph in Google Sheets, you have a couple of different options. You can come up here and you can hit Insert Chart, and it will give you a blank chart. And then you would be responsible for kind of adding in all of this information here, which I prefer. But if you're new to Google Sheets and graphing, it may be better to kind of start with some keyed in information. So I'm going to delete this out. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to highlight all of the cells that I have currently that I have interest in trying to graph. And I'm going to go to Insert, and I'm going to go to Chart. And what will happen from here is that Google Sheets will kind of make a guess based on the data you have, and it will set up the type of chart that you think is most appropriate, which for our benefit is a line chart. However, what I can do is if I don't like that, one, I can change kind of the style of the line chart, or if maybe I think it's better represented by a column graph, or maybe if I think it's better represented by a pie chart, I can change that here. So I'm not locked into what they have. However, I think the one they gave us is just fine. So what we want to do is we want to go ahead and actually start to kind of customize our graph. So what we're going to do is we're going to leave everything alone here because this is all fine. And instead we're going to go to Customize. And when we go to Customize, it's going to give us all of these drop-down menus. We could change the chart style, but we're going to focus really on changing the chart title. So this particular title is not really helpful, doesn't clue the reader into anything except we're changing concentrations of a chemical. So what I want to do is I want to type in a figure number, and this automatically makes it a better setup because what you're doing for the reader is you're making it objective. So instead of saying, oh, the figure on page 4, because that might change as you add a new text, or saying the figure above or below, you're saying figure 3. It's very clear that your viewer, your reader, your audience would be directed to this figure. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up with a more detailed title. For me, this is going to be the effect of propylene glycol and the exposure of that on radish height. So I'd like you to pause the video for a second, come up with a title that makes sense for your data, and then resume when you're ready. One concern that I do need to mention is that with titles, whether it's your x-axis, your y-axis, or your graph title, you can see there are some formatting options down here, but if you choose these, it does the entire term. So maybe instead of radish, I wanted to be a little bit more specific, and I wanted to put in the scientific name of the radish that I was studying, which is maybe R. sativus. I can't just make this part italicized. So what I would recommend is if this is the case for your particular title, I would actually not put a title in right now. I would put just a space in as a placeholder, and then I would go and actually add a text box on top of it. But what we need to do is we also need to adjust our X and our Y axis. There is a nice feature here for a chart subtitle if you think that's appropriate for your project. For this one, I want to clarify what I mean by day 0, because with plants, day 0 could mean the day I put them in the ground. It could be the day I first saw something emerge from the soil. It could mean the day that I first counted true leaves. There could be a lot of different things. So what I want to do is I want to actually clarify this for my reader and just make it a little bit more obvious. Again, this may or may not be appropriate for your project. It really depends on the data that you are collecting. So then from here, I'm going to look at chart subtitle. I'm going to go to my horizontal axis title. So with my horizontal axis title right now, day is absolutely fine. However, since my data is a little bit more consistent across there, I'm going to come back and actually change my horizontal axis just to give us a couple bit more divisions in here so we can see that a little bit more clearly. And then my vertical axis title, I don't have one, so it would be a really good idea to put one in. So I want to put in the height of the radish plant. And I want to put in my units. So I'm going to put in my units here, and they are going to be centimeters for this particular setup. So that's it. Again, you can change these. Just be mindful if you make them too big, you'll notice it gets cut off and there's really nothing you can do about that. So try to find the size that's going to be large enough that you can actually read it, yet not so large that it gets cut off. In addition, you can also see sometimes changing one axis affects another. You can also resize your graph physically if that helps. So what I want to do right now is I want to go into the horizontal axis, like I said. and I'd like to actually put in my own scale factor. So you can see I've got either 0, 0.1, 100, 1000. So I want to leave this at default, but I want to change my setup here so that I can get more detail in this axis. And I'm going to do that as soon as I figure it out. Hold on one second. Okay, so there are two ways that we can go about doing this. If I'm staying in the same spot I was and I treat labels as text, it'll put in every single day for me. I kind of find that a little bit overwhelming. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to go down here to grid lines. And right now it's set on vertical axis, horizontal axis, and I want to change that major grid line count to maybe 5s. Not my major grid line count, that's auto, my minor grid line count to 5s in there. And then that just helps break it up a little bit better so I can see where those different days are. So whatever option works better for you. And then what we need to do is we can go into series and we can change a couple other things. So if we look at series, the purpose of doing this would be to change the colors and the line type, especially if you're printing your data in black and white. The red and the blue that Google Sheets defaults to makes it really hard to tell them apart. So I would recommend either changing the colors so they are very descriptive, or what you can also do is you can change the line dash type, and then it will change it in the legend up here, and that makes it very clear. So even if you were to print this and they all come out gray, by changing the line dash type or the thickness or both, you get something that becomes very clear to your viewer exactly what those different parts look like. You can also put in points if you want to show the actual data values. There's things you can play with. So you can see down here, I changed it. So if I wanted to make it a little bit clearer where those are. But those are, again, kind of judgment calls on your data. Since we really only have one of each day, we would not add error bars, but if you were able to repeat this with either multiple plants or multiple types of experiments, you could. You'd have to see the column graph video on how to do that. You can put in data labels per series, or you can change it so they apply to all series. I tend to be a little hesitant to do this because you can see it makes it very, very overwhelming. What might be better is instead in your text of your research paper or your poster or your manuscript actually calling out, as seen on day 7, a height of 14.2 in propylene glycol, and then go from there. And you can put trend lines in if you think they're appropriate. If maybe you were trying to compare it to a certain correlation value or something, that might be beneficial. It really depends on your project. And the only other thing that I would recommend that you possibly could do, and this is more personal preference, is you can change where the legend is. So here it's up top. Some people like it at the bottom because when you're viewing this, you kind of see the values and come down here. Some people like them on the left or the right, or even inside the graph. It really depends on your personal preference. So at this point, you can see how to set up a line graph in Google Sheets. Thank you for viewing.